January 31st, 1943. In a basement beneath the ruins of Stalingrad's Univermag department store, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus sat at a table staring at a document he'd never imagined signing. The promotion to Field Marshal had arrived just hours earlier. Hitler's message was clear. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. It was an order disguised as an honor, a golden cage with only one honorable exit. But Paulus was done with honor of that kind. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist around him. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the nearly 290,000 men encircled 11 weeks earlier, perhaps 90,000 remained alive. Most could barely stand. They'd eaten the horses in December. By January, they were boiling leather boots for something to put in their stomachs. The surrender Soviet officers entered the basement. Paulus stood, his face hollow, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds. He signed the surrender document with a hand that trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion and starvation, and the weight of what this moment meant. His final radio message to Hitler, sent hours before Soviet troops arrived, contained no drama. Sixth Army, true to their oath and conscious of the lofty importance of their mission, have held their position to the last man and the last round for Führer and fatherland unto the end. The words were correct, formal, empty. What could he say that would matter? The Sixth Army was destroyed. Something larger was surrendering. The siege of Stalingrad, which Hitler had promised would make Germany invincible in the East, had instead swallowed an entire army. But in that basement, as Paulus signed away his army's existence, something larger was surrendering too. The belief that retreat was temporary, that setbacks could be reversed, that Germany's eastern offensive was merely paused for the commanders who understood what Stalingrad meant. This wasn't a battle lost. It was the future, visible and unavoidable. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein understood before most others. As commander of Army Group Dawn, he'd tried to relieve Stalingrad in December, getting within 30 miles before Soviet forces stopped him. He'd urged Paulus to break out while there was still time, still fuel, still strength. Hitler had forbidden it. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad because Hitler had declared it must. After Stalingrad, elastic defense. After Stalingrad fell, Manstein began arguing for something he called elastic defense. The term was careful, diplomatic. What he meant was strategic withdrawal. Give up territory to preserve forces, trade space for time. Shorten the front lines to something Germany could actually defend with the divisions available. He laid it out in his memoirs years later, but the argument was made in real time in early 1943, when the truth was fresh and undeniable. The mathematics. The mathematics were simple. The Soviet Union had more men, more factories, more space to retreat into, more capacity to absorb losses. Germany had already committed everything to the Eastern Front, and it wasn't enough. The backhand blow strategy. Manstein proposed what he called the backhand blow strategy. Let the Soviets advance, stretch their supply lines, then counterattack against their flanks. Cut off their spearheads, destroy them in detail. It required giving up ground. It required accepting that German forces would retreat, sometimes hundreds of miles, before turning to strike. Hitler's response was immediate and absolute. No, not one step back. Every foot of ground given up voluntarily was a foot that would never be retaken. The psychological effect on the German people, the army, Germany's allies would be catastrophic. Territory was prestige, retreat was defeat. Therefore, no retreat. Manstein tried different arguments. He brought maps showing the impossible length of the front lines. He presented casualty reports demonstrating that static defense was bleeding the army white. He explained that mobile defense wasn't retreat, it was operational art. How you won when you couldn't match the enemy's numbers. Hitler would listen, sometimes for hours, then refuse. Hitler's strategic vision. The Führer had his own strategic vision, formed in the trenches of the First World War, hardened by the victories of 1939 through 1941. You won by holding ground and attacking. You lost by retreating. It was that simple, but it wasn't simple. And the commanders who had to execute Hitler's orders knew it. They'd seen what happened at Stalingrad when an army tried to hold an indefensible position. They were watching it happen again in slower motion across the entire Eastern Front. Spring 1943, Operation Citadel. The spring of 1943 brought a brief stabilization. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud, halted major operations. Both sides rebuilt. Both sides planned. Hitler, convinced that one more great victory would break Soviet morale, ordered preparation for Operation Citadel. A massive offensive against the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines that invited envelopment. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, opposed Citadel from the start. The man who'd pioneered blitzkrieg tactics, who'd led the dash to the Channel in 1940 and the drive toward Moscow in 1941, looked at the Citadel plan and saw disaster. The problem was obvious. The problem was obvious to anyone who studied the intelligence reports. The Soviets knew the attack was coming. They'd had months to prepare. The Kursk salient wasn't a vulnerability. It was a fortress. Soviet forces had dug multiple defensive lines, laid millions of mines, positioned thousands of anti-tank guns, concentrated their armor reserves for counterattacks. Guderian argued that Germany's rebuilt panzer divisions should be conserved for mobile defense in the West, where Allied invasion was inevitable. Attacking prepared Soviet defenses would shatter these divisions for no strategic gain. Even if Citadel succeeded tactically, so what? It wouldn't change the fundamental imbalance of forces. It wouldn't knock the Soviet Union out of the war. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding 9th Army in the northern pincer of the Citadel attack, shared Guderian's pessimism. His intelligence staff had identified 8 defensive belts in his sector stretching back nearly 100 miles. His aerial reconnaissance showed Soviet reserves massing behind the lines. He reported these findings to Hitler, not to oppose the offensive, but to ensure everyone understood what they were attacking into. July 5th, the offensive launched July 5th. Within days, Model's 9th Army had advanced perhaps 10 miles at catastrophic cost. Every mile was bought with burning tanks and dead infantry. The southern pincer under Manstein pushed further, but encountered the same grinding resistance. By July 12th, when Soviet forces counterattacked near Prokhorovka in the largest tank battle in history, Citadel had already failed. Hitler called it off. July 13th. The casualty reports told a story Guderian had predicted. Approximately 200,000 German casualties, hundreds of tanks destroyed or damaged. The rebuilt panzer divisions gutted. And for what? The Kursk salient still existed. Soviet forces were already counterattacking. The initiative on the Eastern Front, which Germany had held since June 1941, was gone permanently. Guderian's bitter observation, Guderian's memoirs written after the war, contained a bitter observation about Citadel. The armored formations, reformed and re-equipped with so much effort, had lost heavily both in men and in equipment, and would now be unemployable for a long time to come. The understated language couldn't hide his fury. Germany had thrown away its last offensive reserve for nothing. Hitler drew a different conclusion. But Hitler drew a different conclusion. Citadel hadn't failed because it was strategically unsound. It had failed because the army hadn't pushed hard enough. Commanders had been too cautious. The will to victory had weakened. The solution was more fanaticism, more determination, more refusal to retreat. The pattern repeats. Through late 1943 and into 1944, the pattern repeated across every sector. Soviet offensives would break through German lines. Local commanders would request permission to withdraw to better defensive positions. Hitler would refuse. The positions would be overrun. The forces would be encircled or destroyed. The front would collapse further than any planned withdrawal would have given up. Field Marshal Rommel. Field Marshal Rommel watched this pattern from the West. By 1944, he commanded Army Group B in northern France. Preparing for the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. Rommel had fought the British in North Africa, had learned what happened when you faced an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. He'd retreated across Libya, fought delaying actions, tried to preserve his forces for battles he could win. Now, he was supposed to stop an Allied invasion on the beaches with insufficient forces. The Luftwaffe, nearly absent from the skies, panzer reserves held too far inland by Hitler's insistence on personal control. Rommel studied the situation and saw Stalingrad in slow motion. June 6th, the invasion. The invasion came, June 6th. Within days, Rommel knew the battle was lost. The Allies had established their beachhead. German counterattacks failed to throw them back into the sea. Allied air power made daylight movement suicidal. The panzer reserves, when they finally arrived, were fed into the battle piecemeal and destroyed July 15th. Rommel's memo. On July 15, 1944, Rommel wrote a memo to Hitler. The language was careful, professional, but the message was unambiguous. The troops are fighting heroically everywhere, but the unequal struggle is nearing its end. I must ask you to draw the proper conclusions without delay. The proper conclusions meant negotiating an end to the war. Rommel didn't write that explicitly, couldn't write it explicitly, but everyone who read the memo understood. The war was lost. The only question was how much more destruction Germany would endure before admitting it. Hitler's response. Hitler's response was to relieve Rommel of command after Rommel was wounded in an Allied air attack. The Field Marshal who'd suggested drawing proper conclusions from military reality was replaced with commanders who would fight until there was nothing left to fight with. Operation Bagration. But reality didn't care about Hitler's orders. 3 days after Rommel wrote his memo, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration against Army Group Center in Belarus. It was Stalingrad multiplied by 10. Soviet forces attacking with over 2 million men shattered the German front in the first hours. Entire divisions ceased to exist. Command and control collapsed. Retreat became rout. By the time Bagration ended in late August, Army Group Center had been destroyed. 28 divisions eliminated, approximately 400,000 German casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. The losses exceeded Stalingrad. The Soviet advance reached the gates of Warsaw, liberated Belarus, and pushed into Poland. The survivors, the commanders who survived Bagration, emerged with the hollow eyes of men who'd witnessed something beyond military defeat. They'd seen the Wehrmacht broken as a fighting force. The Eastern Front, which had consumed German strength for 3 years, had finally consumed everything. No reserves left. No veteran divisions to plug the gaps. Just fragments of units, collections of survivors. Boys and old men rushed forward to die in place of the soldiers who no longer existed. The West collapses. In the West, the front collapsed in parallel. Paris fell in August. Allied forces swept across France. By September, they'd liberated Belgium and Luxembourg and were approaching Germany's western border. The 1,000-year Reich was being invaded from 2 directions simultaneously, and the army that was supposed to defend it was scattered across 1,000 miles of retreating front lines. General Heinz Guderian, Chief of the General Staff, General Heinz Guderian, recalled from semi-retirement to serve as Chief of the General Staff, found himself in an impossible position. He was supposed to coordinate the defense of Germany with divisions that existed only on paper fuel that wasn't being produced. Replacement soldiers who'd never fired a rifle before being sent to the front confrontations with Hitler. His confrontations with Hitler became legendary among the surviving staff officers who witnessed them. Guderian would present intelligence reports on Soviet force concentrations, the gaps in German lines, the mathematical impossibility of holding current positions. Hitler would dismiss the intelligence as defeatist lies, redraw the front lines on maps as if moving colored pins could create divisions out of nothing. January 1945. In January 1945, Guderian presented evidence of a massive Soviet buildup for an offensive into Poland and East Prussia. The intelligence was overwhelming. Thousands of tanks, millions of men, artillery concentrations that would make Bagration look like a preliminary bombardment. Hitler's response entered the historical record because it was so absurd that multiple witnesses documented it, the greatest bluff since Genghis Khan. The Soviet offensive. The Soviet offensive launched January 12th. Within days, German forces in Poland were in full retreat. Within weeks, Soviet armies had reached the Oder River, 40 miles from Berlin. Hitler's quote about the greatest bluff had advanced the front line 300 miles westward and destroyed what remained of Germany's eastern armies. February. The Courland pocket. Guderian tried again in February, arguing for evacuating the Courland pocket in Latvia, where 26 divisions were cut off and accomplishing nothing. Those divisions could reinforce the defense of Germany itself. Every general on the staff agreed. The logic was irrefutable. Hitler refused. The Courland divisions would tie down Soviet forces. They would be evacuated by sea when the situation allowed. They would hold their positions. Guderian speaks truth. Guderian, according to his own account and those of witnesses, told Hitler directly that the war was lost. Germany faced complete destruction. The only rational course was to seek terms while there was still something left to negotiate with. Hitler's response was to relieve Guderian of his position. The Chief of the General Staff who dared speak truth, was replaced with someone more compliant. March. The fantasies collapse. By March, Guderian was gone, and the defense of Germany was being coordinated by officers who'd learned that survival meant agreeing with Hitler's fantasies. But the fantasies were collapsing faster than new ones could be invented. In the West, Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March. In the East, Soviet armies encircled Berlin in April. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was being measured in days. The three categories. The commanders who remained fell into three categories. Some, like Heinrich Himmler, pursued delusional schemes to negotiate separate peace with the Western Allies, as if the Allies would ignore their unconditional surrender policy. Some, like Hermann Göring, tried to position themselves as Hitler's successors, ready to surrender on slightly better terms. And some, like Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl, simply continued following orders because they didn't know what else to do. April 30th, Hitler's suicide. Hitler committed suicide, April 30th. Admiral Karl Dönitz, named as his successor, inherited a Germany that had ceased to exist as a functional state. The question wasn't whether to surrender, but how to manage the surrender to save as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity. May 7th, 1945, unconditional surrender. On May 7th, 1945, General Alfred Jodl sat in a red schoolhouse in Reims, France, and signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The ceremony was brief, formal, empty of drama. Jodl had been authorized to sign by Dönitz, who'd been authorized by Hitler's will, which had been written in a bunker while Soviet shells fell on the ruins above. Jodl's statement at the signing contained no defiance, no claims of fighting honorably against overwhelming odds, no suggestions that Germany had been betrayed from within, just exhaustion, no hope for lenient treatment. He expressed hope for lenient treatment of the German people. The hope was faint. The victors had seen the concentration camps, counted 20 million Soviet dead, 6 million Polish dead, millions more across Europe. Watched Germany fight to the last possible moment, destroying cities and infrastructure and lives in a war that had been lost for years. The numbers at surrender. The numbers at surrender told the story of what permanent retreat had meant. Approximately 7,600,000 German prisoners of war in Allied hands, 5,300,000 German military dead, millions more wounded, missing, or broken. An army that had marched into Poland in September 1939 with the confidence of inevitable victory had retreated all the way back to Berlin and beyond, into captivity and graves. But the retreat was never acknowledged. But the retreat had never been acknowledged as permanent until the very end. Hitler had forbidden the word commanders who suggested strategic withdrawal were relieved or ignored. Armies that should have retreated to defensible lines were ordered to hold indefensible positions and were destroyed in place. The mobile defense Manstein had advocated in early 1943, which might have prolonged the war or created opportunities for negotiated settlement, was rejected in favor of fanatical last stands that accomplished nothing except higher casualties. The commanders who survived to surrender, who lived to write their memoirs and testify at Nuremberg, all told variations of the same story. They'd known. Some had known after Stalingrad, others after Kursk. Most after the summer of 1944, They'd known the war was lost, that retreat was permanent, that Germany was headed for total defeat. But knowing and acting were different. But knowing and acting on knowledge were different things. The Wehrmacht was Hitler's instrument. Its commanders served at his pleasure. Speaking truth to Hitler meant relief, from command at best, execution at worst. The few who tried, like the officers involved in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, were hanged with piano wire, the impossible position. So the commanders who knew the truth but couldn't act on it found themselves in an impossible position. They could see the future clearly, calculate the mathematics of declining force ratios and shrinking territories and exhausted resources, read intelligence reports on Soviet and Allied strength, know what the end would look like, and then they went back to their headquarters and issued orders for one more defensive line, one more counterattack, one more desperate attempt to hold ground that couldn't be held, because those were the orders from above, and the system they served had no mechanism for acknowledging reality. The tragedy wasn't just that Germany lost. The tragedy was that Germany lost slowly, expensively, destructively, grinding itself and much of Europe to ruins in a retreat that everyone with eyes could see was permanent, but no one with authority would admit. 2 signatures in the Univermag basement in Stalingrad, Paulus had signed the first acknowledgement. In the schoolhouse in Reims, Jodl signed the last. Between those 2 signatures lay 2 years and 3 months of permanent retreat that was never called retreat, defensive lines that existed only on maps, armies that fought and died in place because withdrawal was forbidden, even when withdrawal was the only sane option. The commanders knew the commanders knew. The evidence was overwhelming. The trajectory was clear. But the system they served valued fanaticism over rationality, propaganda over truth, Hitler's intuition over military reality. So they fought on, retreating all the way to unconditional surrender. And the retreat was only acknowledged as permanent when there was nowhere left to retreat to. Conclusion: if this story of commanders who saw the truth but couldn't act on it, of a retreat that was never admitted until the end, has moved you, subscribe to Frontline America World War II right now. Hit that like button and share this with anyone who wants to understand what German commanders said when they realized retreat was permanent. Drop a comment. At what point should German commanders have forced the issue? And where in the world are you watching from? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.